In today's gospel reading, our Lord points out that when he is taken away from his disciples, then they will fast. In other words, the followers of our Lord will practice fasting. Interestingly enough, when we look at the early church, they fasted quite often, not just during Lent, but 3 times a week during Lent. Every single day was a fast day. And that's in the early church. And over time, the church, out of concern for the welfare of her members, understanding that some people have very heavy physical work to do, that they relaxed the requirements of fasting. So now it's only twice in a year, so Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, that we are required to fast. We can voluntarily undertake more fasting. What's also interesting is that every major religion in the world practices some form of fasting. And the reason they do this is because they recognize the tremendous benefit that results from fasting. Now, on one level, sure, having to deny yourself of food, having to experience a little bit of hunger, it's difficult. Being more tired, it's physically difficult, it's physically challenging for many people, but spiritually and psychologically, there are so many benefits to fasting. Now, one of the physiological benefits is that when we don't eat, or when we don't eat as much, it gives our digestive system, our digestive organs, a chance to rest and to be recharged. And during this time, the body actually helps to rid the body of toxins. So in other words, when we're always eating, we're always putting stuff into us, and especially today, including toxins. So there's probably toxins in the water that we drink and some of the food, processed food and things like that. So the body, it kind of has to rid itself of all those things, but if we're constantly putting stuff into ourselves, the body doesn't have a chance to do that. So when we fast, the digestive organs can rest, the body can rid itself of toxins, and you may have noticed this sometimes. If you eat a really big lunch, after lunch, you get really tired, you get very sleepy. And part of the reason for that is all your blood, or most of your blood, is going to your digestive system because you need to digest all that food. There may be other reasons also, your level of, like if you have diabetes or something like that, your level of insulin might also impact that also. But anyways, the point I wanted to make is that when we fast, because there's less blood going to our digestive system, there's actually more blood going to our brain, which makes it easier for us to think and to focus. Now, in today's first reading from the book of Isaiah, it mentioned that when people fasted, they kind of were pursuing their own interests. In other words, it's not just denying food, but in other words, we need to have the right attitude towards fasting. So why do we undertake the fast? Not just because we have to, but because we know it's beneficial for us. And we do it not just because it's beneficial, but because we want to grow closer to God. So the reason that the disciples of our Lord did not fast when our Lord was with them, is because it's all about being with God. It's all about being connected with God. It's all about being united to God. So when they are united to Him, they don't need to fast. But when our Lord is taken away, when the bridegroom is taken away, then His disciples will fast, because fasting will enable them to get closer to God. Any of you who have seriously undertaken fasting, and I don't mean just one day, but on a regular basis or for an extended period of time, you, I'm sure, probably noticed it's so much easier to pray. It's so much easier to connect with God. It's so much easier to feel the presence of God. But like I said, our fasting has to be directed towards God. When we feel that physical hunger, we should transform that and transform it into the hunger we feel for God, the desire that we feel for God, so that we long for God, body and soul. And when God sees that we are willing to sacrifice for Him, God will give us consolations. God will reveal Himself to us. Now, when it comes to fasting, I think it's also important to keep in mind that, part of it is to enhance our prayer life, to improve our prayer life. But if we are filling our mind with garbage, with junk, then it's going to be very difficult for us to focus on God. In other words, someone who denies themselves food, in other words, they're fasting, but they're filling themselves full of images and watching movies and Netflix all day long, well, it's not going to benefit them. Fasting is not going to benefit them. So in other words, we have to fast from worldly things also. So if we really want God, then we have to be willing to rid our mind of all these things. The reality is that when we go to pray, let's say somebody decides they're going to spend time in mental prayer or meditating on some passage of the scriptures, of the Gospels, and they allot themselves 30 minutes, let's just say. Well, very often what happens is when you're there trying to pray to God, your mind is filled with the events that you've recently experienced, the movies that you've seen, the images that you've looked at, the people that you've interacted with, or the things that have bothered you. So in other words, your brain is so busy with all these things, it becomes very hard to pray. It becomes very hard to meditate. And so when it comes to fasting, it's not just fasting from food, but we need to limit all those worldly things that fill our mind and our imagination. This is also why St. Francis de Sales, in his book Introduction to the Devout Life, where he encourages meditation and talks about how lay people should meditate, he recommends that they do it first thing in the morning. Why? Because when you do it later in the day, your mind is going to be more filled with the events of the day. So if you do it first thing in the morning, ideally, because you've slept at night, your mind is clearer. Your mind is not cluttered and absorbed by thoughts of all the things that have taken place, that would normally take place in a given day. So if you want to get closer to God, fast, but not just from food, but from all those things that can fill our mind and distract our mind from the things of God.